boy, wow, that was, G. Van Fleet, I am also an anti-communist. And the deep state is the communists. That's something to keep in mind. Communism, socialism, it's a new religion. So when you say they persecute religions, they wipe out religion, they're wiping out their competition. And then it makes me remember this poem, and it's an English translation of what G. Van Fleet probably recited in school. Red is the east, where comes the sun. China has brought forth a Mao Zedong. Mao's a god. These communist leaders, they want to deify themselves. And you look at Stalin, the god, Lenin. Lenin is in a tomb in Red Square, to this day, embalmed. Like, you know, Pharaoh was a god. They put the pharaohs out there. They mummified him. He's a mummy. He's been preserved for over 100 years. He just had his 100th anniversary of his death here in January of this year. And he's still there. You know, an ear hasn't fallen off. He hasn't turned a different color. One day he will probably. But it is a religion. And Mao Zedong, in the late 1920s, he wrote an essay in which he said, the first rule in politics is to know who your friends are and know who your enemies are. That's basic orientation. We don't know that. As a society, we have been disoriented as to who our friends and enemies are. Now, I want to talk today about my attendance last month at the special conference on Arctic security in Toronto. I got invited by the McKinsey Institute, and I got to meet the recent commander of NORTHCOM and NORAD, General Glenn Van Herk, 4-star general. I had dinner with him and some of his Canadian colleagues one night, and then got to hear him speak the next day. And I got to be on a panel with the former Canadian ambassador to Russia, who her take on Arctic security was, well, we all know the number one threat to the Arctic is global warming, right? Is climate change. It's a very interesting thing. How could she say that? Is she really that naive? Because with General Van Herk, he sort of shocked me. He told me things I didn't know. Did you know that we have worn out our early warning planes? And that now we're going to retire them, and NORAD and NORTHCOM, that defends North America, is going to go 4 years without any early warning aircraft. How many of you know that? And early warning aircraft, General Scott Clancy, who was the head of NORAD operations, recently stepped down. He gave a speech at the conference, and he said, you know, your continuity of government depends on early warning. For your government to get underground, for your leaders, for your legislature to be able to take shelter, they have to have warning. And these new weapons that the Russians are deploying, and the Chinese are building them, hypersonic missiles and the new long-range cruise missiles, I didn't know this. These long-range cruise missiles, a Russian or Chinese bomber can fire one from Russian territory. And by the way, Chinese bombers are flying out of Russian bases right now in the Arctic. They can fire that missile from Russian territory, and it can hit Minneapolis, it can hit Toronto, it can hit Milwaukee from Russia, fired from a bomber that far away. They can fire a hypersonic missile that goes way up, comes way down, and like a cruise missile, it goes below the radar. It's impossible, once it gets down low enough, it's impossible to shoot down. And General Van Herk said, no, we can't shoot those. He says, they've been shot down in Ukraine, but they were too high up because they didn't have enough room when they launched them. If they launch them from the high Arctic, they have plenty of room to get low. By the time they get close to North America, he says, we can't actually even track them now. We don't have the technology, and they can maneuver. So with a ballistic missile launched from Russia or China comes over the Arctic, by the way, the Chinese missiles would come over the Arctic too, you can tell by the trajectory, okay, this is the city they're aiming for. This is where they're going. And we've got 40 ABM launchers and we can defend you. We could put so many to defend Washington or to defend, our command and control or whatever. But these other missiles, you can't shoot them down with the ABM, the cruise missiles and the hypersonics. And General Scott Clancy, in his explanation, he said, they can strike your early warning radars and your defenses. So the Russian bombers could literally fly. They could literally fly right over Los Angeles, anywhere, and nobody could stop them. Chinese bombers, they could do that. Once they cleared a path with the other kinds of weapons attacking. And the warning, Scott Clancy had what he called Scott's report card. He gives NORAD an F for its ability to defend North America, and he gives it a D- for early warning. And I was shocked when General Van Herk said, well, NORAD used to have 1,000 planes to defend North America, but now we have 24. 24? And it's unbelievable. And of course, the problem is we're not producing. You've heard earlier about our manufacturing. There was a Canadian admiral there saying, we want to rebuild our Navy, but we don't have people with the skills. It's all gone overseas. He said the same thing with the U.S. Navy. We've got a real problem. So we've got all these problems. And then the Russian submarines. General Van Herk shocked me, and the admiral backed him up on this. Russia has submarines. They send 4 submarines off our west coast and 5 off our east coast. And he said, General Van Herk said, there are months at a time where we don't know where they are. They're that quiet. And he said they can launch these cruise missiles and they can go anywhere. And it's very difficult to track him. He said, I could try to shoot down one with a fighter, but then he had a dubious look on his face, like shooting down a cruise missile with a fighter is not easy. And of course, he doesn't have a lot of fighter assets. By the way, he explained the balloon shoot down thing to me. He was the general that shot down the balloons. And it was a very interesting story. The problem, if they had been able to shoot them down over Canada, where there weren't very many people, they could have, but everywhere it was in the U.S., there were people underneath it. And it was a huge thing. And it had a 60-mile perimeter where it could fall, and it could have fallen and killed people on the ground. So that's why they didn't, but they shot it down off the coast where no one would get hurt, and then they recovered everything. And they knew its path was flying over 2 nuclear missile fields, Minuteman silos. And they just closed everything down, camouflaged everything, shut down all the communications, so the Chinese got nothing. But it wasn't thanks to, the problem that the Canadian generals and General Van Herk said is, look, we go to Ottawa, we go to Washington, we ask, look, we need to rebuild the DEW line, we need more radars, we need more early warning planes, we need more fighters. What does Ottawa and what does Washington say? Not interested. The politicians are not interested. These are the problems. We're basically wide open from the north to attack. Now, it's interesting. Russia and China are getting together. I mentioned, I hadn't known this, Chinese bombers are flying out of Russian bases. Did you know China's building icebreakers? And now there's an interesting thing about Indian tribes in the far north, in the Arctic, Native American tribes in the Canadian Arctic. In Canada, Indians have a kind of sovereignty that they don't have in the U.S. And there was a very significant tribal group in the Arctic where they were sitting on potential mines and port facilities in the Arctic. The Chinese went and offered them enormous sums of money to bribe their way into that region. And of course, these Native American Canadians realized that the Chinese were going to exploit them, and they didn't take the deal. But if the Chinese could get in, they would do like they've done in the South China Sea. They'd say, oh, now it's our territory. They would actually claim it. They would take it away from Canada. And there were people in Canada that were very worried about this possibility that China could get control of the Canadian Arctic, building icebreakers, getting in there, pushing in, because Ottawa won't develop the Canadian Arctic. There's a massive raw materials in the Canadian Arctic, minerals especially. But of course, it takes a big investment to get up there. Once you make the investment, then you've got it. The Chinese are willing to make the investment because they want to buy their way in. They want that territory. Now imagine if you're launching an attack on the US and Canada from the other side of the pole. It's further. It's the closest direct route to attack us. But imagine if you were able to get into the Canadian Arctic. You have just advanced thousands of kilometers closer to where all the people live in Canada and the US, in the northern US and Canada. So it's no joke. The Russians years ago extended the range of their fighter aircraft so that they could fly over this region and help their bombers. And the range on the Russian and Chinese bombers, those things can fly right to where we are right now. So it's not, and besides, they can mount missiles on them that can go, you know, enormous distances. The strike capacity is hard to imagine. And the problem is it's neglected. Nobody cares. Here we have this, I don't know, it's a perversion of relevance. What people think is important and what is actually important and what people talk about in political campaigns or wherever they talk about, how about survival? How about the country's survival? Nuclear weapons are usable. I hate to tell you that. If you ground burst them, you do get short-term fallout, lasts 13 to 18 days downwind. The long-term fallout from hydrogen bombs is insignificant. We already had more fallout from that in the 1950s and 60s from atomic bombing test fallout that happened with the dirty atomic bombs. Remember, fission is dirty, fusion is clean, right? So hydrogen bombs, they're workable. The Australian government did a study in 1980 on what the effect of a full-blown nuclear war in the northern hemisphere would be. You're talking about blowing up 40,000 nukes. And they said, well, there'd be a few more cancers and leukemias in Australia, but the cancer rate would go down because the import of tobacco from the US would be cut off by the war. So that's the real, you know, statistics. Those are the real studies. And a nuclear winter? You know, nobody ever bothered to look, you know, everybody heard about the T-TAP study that, remember, Carl Sagan was on it. A nuclear winter came out of Russia. The Russian scientists provided the numbers. One of the Russian scientists defected and told us, hey, Andropov put us up to it, the former KGB chief. This was to stop the deployment of missiles in Europe during the 1980s, our Pershing missiles. But nuclear winter is a fabrication. The US government actually did a study. Nobody ever quoted it. It came out in, I think, the early 90s. I read it. It was horribly boring. But the conclusion of the study was, yeah, you could create a nuclear winter effect. You would have to build a nuclear bomb the size of the Empire State Building. It would take more uranium than exists on Earth, so you'd have to go to the moon to mine the uranium. It would cost more than the gross domestic product of all the world's countries put together. And then you would have a bomb you could create nuclear winter with. But those little firecrackers that we use in war, it's nothing. You know, Krakatoa was more than several thousand nuclear wars just from one volcanic eruption. So nature produces much more than what we can do. So, and it's the same thing. And by the way, the numbers for climate change, global warming, they're the same batch of numbers that concocted the nuclear winter hypothesis. So getting back to this Arctic thing, a future war against Russia and China, which are allied, by the way, and North Korea is in there now too, a future war happens over the Arctic and over the North Pacific. And you've seen some maps here earlier, Colonel John Mills showed us. Because it's the shortest distance between 2 points. Where the missiles and the bombers will fly over, it's where the ships will go. And that's why it needs to be defended. And so I just want to let people know that this is something our politicians need to know about and we need to talk about more. And so with that, I will end.